across the globe by satellite. Join us for Welcome to Grace, where we'll discover together the distinctiveness of Paul's apostleship through the rightly divided word of truth. Now, join pastor and Bible teacher Curt Crist as we explore the unsearchable riches of Christ.
Well, thank you for coming and joining us, and welcome to Grace. Some weeks back, we were looking at the book of Acts in light of Paul's statements that believers are to be following him today. And we see that statement made more than once. We actually see it made 3 times. We'll put those on the overhead before you today. 2 appear in 1 Corinthians, and we find the 3rd in Paul's letter to the saints at Philippi. So here they are put together. Let's take a quick look. In 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16, Paul writes, "Wherefore I beseech you," or plead with you. Actually, I'm begging you is the intent there. "Be ye followers of me." Then again, same epistle, chapter 11, verse 1, Paul writes, "Be ye followers of me, even as I," and I like to think of that expression, "even as I, in the same way that I also am a follower of Christ." Philippians 3:17, "Brethren, be followers together of me, and mark them which walk so as ye have us for an ensample," for a pattern. So you see, Paul wants us to follow him. And for very good reason. He is the apostle of the Gentiles. He said he magnifies his office, called out by the ascended Lord of glory, who continued a ministry after his ascension to the apostle Paul for the Gentiles. So that we all understand, each of Paul's statements is made within a specific context. So there's a specific context that points to the way we're to be following Paul. We cannot take all of these passages together and say they all point to Paul's special or unique Gentile apostleship. Context must decide in what manner Paul would have us be followers together of him. So let's take the statements before us. We'll take them in reverse order, and I'll show you what I'm talking about here. We'll consider each within the specific context in which it was written. The statement there in Philippians chapter 3, verse 13 or verse 14, where Paul writes, "I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus." This statement is made within a specific context. So what is it? Well, Paul would have every grace age believer follow him in the particular quest he mentions here, pressing toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. You see, Paul is not talking about his unique Gentile apostleship in verse 17. He's not speaking of the mystery here revealed to him for grace age saints. That is not the context of Philippians chapter 3:17. That context has nothing at all to do with magnifying Paul's office as the apostle of the Gentiles, or about the truth that had been hidden from ages and generations until it was revealed to this new apostle Paul to proclaim it to us. Philippians chapter 3, verse 17 is not about making all men see what is the fellowship of the mystery. It's not about the preaching of Jesus Christ according to the revelation of the mystery. The context of Philippians 3:17 leads us in an entirely different direction. When Paul speaks of pressing toward the mark for the prize of the high calling in Christ Jesus, we find the context to be the words that he spoke back in verse 10. So let's return to verse 10. Well, there it is in front of you. Philippians 3:10 reads this way, "That I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being made conformable unto his death." It's important we understand that when Paul states, "Brethren, be followers together of me, and mark them which walk so as ye have us for a pattern," verse 17, it's within the context of verses 10 and 14. And that statement is made with a specific context in mind. Christ sacrificed self for the sake of others. That's what his death at Calvary was all about. Paul's talking about being made conformable unto Christ's death in Philippians 3:10. A closely related passage to the type of sacrifice Paul has in mind in this passage sits in Romans chapter 12, where Paul states in verse 1, "I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice." holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable, and what's the next word? Service. This is your reasonable service. Note this has nothing whatsoever to do with gaining salvation or maintaining salvation. You couldn't affect either of those with all the reasonable service you could render. Romans 12:1 has to do with the reasonable service of the believer in light of the service that Christ performed on everyone in the world's behalf. It's simply been given to men to either accept or reject what Christ has already accomplished at Calvary. The service of the believer today, then, is to be based upon appreciation of what Christ has already done and the security that we have in Him, rather than apprehension based upon a supposition of what God may or may not do in the future for us. Sure, it comes as no surprise to many of you folks. It doesn't come as a surprise to us who understand rightly dividing the word of truth and what Christ has accomplished for us, that many people involved in religion's domain are dealing with God on the basis of probation rather than salvation. Satan's ministers of righteousness are continually offering people probation. Now listen to this definition of the word probation, and you tell me if religious folk are not dealing with God on the basis of probation. Here it is. Probation, a period during which somebody's suitability for a job or other role, perhaps heaven when it comes to religion, is being tested. Have you ever thought of God testing your suitability to see whether or not to take you to heaven? Well, we've all grown up in religion, and that's been the idea with most of us. What do Satan's ministers of righteousness want people to think? Listen to what they preach. The idea being set forth by most is that God's making a list and He's checking it twice. Where have we heard that expression before? Not just to see who has been naughty or nice, but to see who can muster sufficiently sincere sorrow for sin that they pledge devotion to God by dedicating themselves to turn away from all sin and never commit sin again. And then God must make a decision in their minds whether or not to save that individual. Their suitability for heaven, we might say, depends upon their turning away from all of their sin. If we'll simply dedicate ourselves to no longer sin, that's the idea. God testing over and over again the validity of that dedication, He'll know if we're truly devoted to Him. Then God will be able to finally make a decision as to whether or not we're heaven worthy. And that's the idea in most folks' mind. It's the idea being promoted by ministers of righteousness. Folks, that's probation. That's not salvation. Your devotion to God is not what saves you. And your dedication to turn from sin will not accomplish your salvation either. Nothing wrong with either one of those things, but neither will save anyone.